I think we will. I feel good about it. But this makes me feel better about it. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Marguerite. Bye-bye.
All right.
On to the next one.
Hey, that was great.
This has a... this one has, let's see, undecided.
Okay. You did a good job with the first one.
Thank you. Off to the bus.
Up next on C-SPAN, from a temple in Manchester, New Hampshire, a portion of a presidential forum recorded this weekend. We begin our coverage with the remarks of former Arizona Governor Bruce Babbitt.
I was going to introduce Governor Babbitt to you based on information that I had gotten about his background, but as many of you know who are a member of this temple, one of our members, Richard Sneerson, has been a supporter of Governor Babbitt's for quite some time, and Richard asked that he be given the opportunity to introduce his candidate to you. So at this time I'd like to introduce Richard Sneerson, who will introduce Governor Babbitt.
Thank you, Barry. Madam President, Judith Wolf, and other members of the congregation. I think I recognize many of you, but with these lights, it's very hard to see. I'm really honored to be here tonight to introduce to you Bruce Babbitt and his wife, Hattie Babbitt, who's with him. I'm a very lucky person in the sense that I had an opportunity through a mutual friend to become involved in his campaign right at the very start here in New Hampshire. Bruce Babbitt has an excellent background, a resume that I and many of you would be very happy to have, having done extremely well in his academic studies, graduating with honors from college, going on to be a Marshall Scholar in Europe and Harvard Law School. He'll tell you more about his background and his philosophy and his policies. He's also been recognized in many ways as the Attorney General of Arizona, as Governor of Arizona. He was elected governor twice with increasing margins on the second time in a heavily Republican state as a Democrat. That's an accomplishment in and of itself. Plus the fact he was an effective governor in that state and got through many programs in a state that is much like ours with a heavily Republican-dominated legislature. But more than all these things that I can tell you about his accomplishments, and I could take all of his time reading this long list of them, the most important thing is that the opportunity I have had to be with him and to see that this is a really genuine person, someone who is very down to earth, a person who is not only fun to be with, but a person who's very caring about other people. And in his quest for the presidency, the message he's giving you is something that he seriously believes in. And while I may not agree with exactly everything that he says on certain of the issues, on the whole, I agree with him, and he's convinced me on some of the issues where I might have slightly disagreed with him. In short, there was an article in New York Magazine recently, and it said about Bruce Babbitt, he's a truly decent man. I can tell you that I've gotten to know him very well, and not only he is a truly decent man, but his wife, Hattie, is also a very truly decent person too, and I'm honored to be here tonight to introduce them.
Thank you, Rich. I appreciate the chance to be here. Hattie was out campaigning this afternoon, and she came back to the hotel where I was watching the Olympics on television, and it caused me to reflect upon what an extraordinary spouse I have and how much a part of my life she is. And I would just like her to stand up so you can all see her. I must tell you about her by just repeating a story that will illustrate how much a part of my life she is. It's a story I once heard about a friend of mine named Pete Flaherty, who used to be the mayor of Pittsburgh. Pete had a very dynamic wife named Nancy, who was very much a part of his life. And it turned out that one Saturday morning they were out looking at construction projects in the city of Pittsburgh. They were walking underneath a half-completed building, and a couple of stories up there was a hard hat on a steel girder who recognized Nancy and sort of saw them down in the street, and he leaned over and shouted down. He said, Nancy, do you remember me? We grew up together in the same small town. We went to school together. As a matter of fact, we were sweethearts for all those years. You remember how terrific it was? Down in the street, there's silence. I mean, you know, what do you say? That night over the dinner table, Pete turns to Nancy and says, Nancy, aren't you glad you married me? Just think, if you hadn't married me, you'd probably be the wife of some construction worker rather than the wife of the mayor of Pittsburgh. Nancy turns to him and says, Pete, you ought to be darn glad you married me, because if you hadn't, he'd be the mayor of Pittsburgh. I know the time is brief, and I want to mix it up with questions, so I'll see if I can traverse a lot of ground very briefly. I come before you as a Democrat. My roots were formed in the streets of Selma, Alabama in the spring of 1965, in the Civil Rights Movement for 2 years after that, working abroad in Latin America in community action programs. During my tenure as governor, a progressive Democrat in a very conservative state who fought hard and put together a long record of progress in child welfare, education, health care, the care of the elderly. I'm a passionate and unrelenting advocate of the environment. The League of Conservation Voters yesterday in Concord handed out 1A to the governor of Arizona. I might add that I'm the former governor of Arizona. But I'd like to take 10 or 15 minutes tonight just to talk about one issue. It's the economic issue, because frankly, we're in serious danger of running through an entire campaign for the presidency without ever once having a meaningful debate about the central challenges facing our future. I think we're all increasingly aware that over the last 7 years, the Reagan administration has left us a record of economic chaos, and that we're now living in an economy that spends too much and earns too little, that consumes too much and saves too little, that demands too much and produces too little. We're living with an administration that advocates an economic policy of instant gratification. It's a policy of living today, of the democratic response. Now, one response, and the dominant response, and the disappointing response so far, has been the traditional one. The issue is too difficult to discuss honestly, so we'll walk around it. We'll pretend that it doesn't exist, that that budget deficit really somehow isn't terribly important. You'll hear from candidates as follows. We can have it all for free. It's the old-style politics. One candidate says, we'll grow our way out of the problem. Another one says, we'll hire more tax collectors. Would you believe that? Would you believe that? Another one says, well, let's blame it on the Japanese and the Koreans, as if somehow we could transfer the problems that we confront abroad. Basically, it's the old-style politics. It's a politics of candidates who will walk up here in one long parade and promise you everything. They'll take you window shopping, pointing out all of the things that we need in the future. But you see, if we don't discuss those central economic problems and the meaning of that deficit and the need for basic changes in the American workplace, it's a hoax. It's a giant hoax that degrades the political process, that speaks down to all of you, that says, we'll tell you what we think you want to hear, rather than what it is we know we must say and do together. Now, the better response, in my judgment, is to step right up and be honest about our economic future and to challenge the American people to step up to a real response. I remember a snowy day in January, back in 1961, when a new president stood up to address the United States of America and electrified the citizens of this country by saying, it's time to move past the old politics of promises and to reach straight out and challenge Americans and say, ask what you can do for your country, what you can do for all of us together. And that's the reason I've spent this campaign trying to challenge all of you to say, here's a theory and an approach to restraining expenditures. Not across the board, because that's not moral to cut programs equally across the board, but to do it through use of this concept called needs testing, to say that people who don't need benefits quite as much ought to have a little less. That's why I've spoken to you consistently about the need to get rid of all this flim-flam about taxes as a last resort. We'll hire more tax collectors to search your kitchens and your bedrooms for hidden money, to say, you know, we'll grow our way out of it. And I've said, if we're going to be honest, if we care about America, if we're patriots, if we care about our children, we got to have the honesty to talk about both expenditure cuts and tax increases. Now, I don't think that meeting that kind of challenge is impossibly difficult. It'll take some work and, sure, a little bit of sacrifice, just as it took sacrifice to win World War I, to make it through the Great Depression, to prevail in World War II, to lead the world. I mean, after all, we're the people who pushed back a frontier, settled a continent, built a democracy, liberated Europe, reached for the moon. Nobody handed us that success. We had to earn it. And just as it was worth it then, I think meeting this challenge today will be worth it now, because it'll lay the foundation for prosperity and for growth and for the resources to take care of our parents, to provide for our children, to have a better educational system, to clean up our environment, to lead the world. Now, lastly, I would simply say this. Think of this election not just as a test of candidates, and not just as a test of the American political system. Think of it in a more basic way, as a question, a test, if you will, as to whether or not people are still ready to meet great challenges, still ready to work together for a common goal, still ready to see our interests as something greater than just ourselves. Don't ever try to tell me the American people aren't willing to pass that test, because our history and my life experience tells us otherwise. Nothing, not one election, 10 elections, 100 elections, will ever convince me that the people of the United States are incapable of rising to a challenge. Now let me be candid, if I may, in the spirit in which I entered this campaign and continue. New Hampshire this Tuesday has within its grasp the power of life and death over my candidacy. There's some people who tell you my candidacy is over. They're the same people who tell you your vote doesn't really matter. They're the cynics. They preach the conventional wisdom. They're not always right. In fact, they're usually wrong. And on Tuesday, you have an opportunity to prove them wrong again. Because you see, I don't need to win the New Hampshire primary in order to take my message of the new politics of challenge and truth-telling down south. What I need to do, and what you can do for and with me, is simply to send a message to the rest of America that here in the snowy hills of New England, a message of courage and hope and challenge was kept alive. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Prefer to just field questions?
Really would. Okay, what I'd prefer to do is just wing it And if you'll be willing to repeat some of your written questions, let's just go for it. Wow. This is one of my competitors for the presidency here. Yeah, will you give me a short question? Now, see, candidates ask questions and then give speeches. That includes me. Short question.
If Jesse Jackson's getting basically his ethnic vote and a little bit of the Caucasian vote, and Mike Dukakis up here in New Hampshire is getting basically his ethnic vote, 33 to 30% of the Democratic vote in New Hampshire is Greek, and just a little bit of the rest of the white Caucasian vote. So what's the big deal about his getting 40% in the polls?
My friend, I'll tell you something. Jesse Jackson got more white votes in Iowa than Bruce Babbitt did. So, am I a believer in ethnic politics? No. I'm a believer in the politics of issues, and that's what our party's about, and it works. Okay. Yeah.
Did I hear you recommending a tax increase if you became president? And if so, how can you really be serious about wanting to become president if, by all accounts, it killed Fritz Mondale in the last campaign? His recommendation that there be a tax increase.
Am I serious about a, God, do I dare mention the T word? Yes, I am serious, because you see, that's what the politics of truth and challenge is about. The candidates have been terrorized into avoiding the issues. And you see this budget deficit? It's eroding our future. It's like an acid corroding our institutions and our economic productivity. It's responsible for that trade deficit. And we all know that it's stealing the future from our kids. And what I don't understand is how a candidate can come before you saying, I'm running for president, and not deal with that issue. Now, George Bush, rumored to be the vice president of the United States, no, I'm serious. You can look it up. You know, he comes here and says, my plan is a tax cut. I think you got to ask, do people who pander like that really deserve the hearing of the American people? No. But we ought to just have a good discussion about what kind of tax increase. Should it be coupled with budget cuts? Sure. How about saying we'll cut $1 and raise $1? Does that appeal to you? Oh, somebody, just give me one little tentative. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, maybe. What are the alternatives? And can't we talk about equitable ways of raising money on a progressive basis? We must. We must if we care about the future of our kids. We got to challenge the American people and say, how is it that we've become so timid? That's why I want you to keep me in this race, because I want you down in Texas, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, asking me that same question. Because then I'm going to turn it against those other candidates and say, come on, I'm going to herd you to the water hole. I'm going to herd you, and I'm going to try to make you drink the water. Because it's the water of truth. It's not hemlock. The next question is, how do you pay for it? And when the candidates promise it for you, march them up and say, how do you pay for it? Now, how do I pay for it? I propose that we should tax the Social Security and Medicare benefits of upper income people who have a lot of other income, that they should include their government benefits on their tax return. You willing to do that? See, that's how you can pay for it. That's how you can pay for
it. You were part of the civil rights movement of the 60s. I was wondering what policies you think are necessary to continue progress today.
You know, back in, I'll repeat the question just in case you haven't heard, from now on I'll repeat them. The question is, what is the agenda for the civil rights movement today? Back in the 60s, when I was in Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana, we were struggling to break down the legal barriers. And in retrospect, it was a glorious time because our goals were just crystal clear. The Attorney General of the United States was enforcing the laws, the Supreme Court was making new law, and we kindled an incredible spirit of progress and optimism and hope. We need to get back to some of that. What do we do? First of all, we need an Attorney General. We need an Attorney General. You know, what have we come to? What have we come to when the Attorney General of the United States stands in the eyes of the American citizen for the proposition that public service isn't enough, that you have to spend your spare time scheming to get rich with your friends? That's the problem in Washington. Now, the larger issues in civil rights, it seems to me, beyond good law enforcement are two. One is the economic one of jobs. The other is the issue of early childhood. I have one overriding social priority. It stems from the fact that we've got to get started with our kids earlier. We must have universally available daycare in this country. We must have universally available preschool and Head Start. There'll be some money involved, but it's a tremendous investment because, you see, we're losing kids way too early in the system, and it is the priority. Yeah.
You speak of the challenge to America of rebuilding from the essential strength. Over the past 7 years, both the Congress and the administration has done everything possible to limit that challenge to big business and small business and medium-sized business. They've taken the incentives away from real estate, construction and building by doubling the depreciation schedules. They've taken the ability of corporate America to not invest in their own businesses by taking away the investment tax credit. During your introduction, it was stated that you worked in Latin America. They took away the Western Hemisphere Trade Corporation legislation, which gave business an inducement to invest in Latin America. It's wonderful for you to talk about the challenge, but how would you implement the challenge and make profit no longer a dirty word for American business?
Well, I don't think profit's a dirty word, and I don't think that there's any danger that this country is headed in that direction. The depreciation schedule should have been repealed. It was an absolutely unwarranted tax shelter to allow people with high incomes to pay less than their fair share of taxes. And it was a justifiable and appropriate change in the tax code. The case for the investment tax credit is a little more debatable on both sides. We don't have the money to give it back right now. We have a budget deficit. And I'm not about ready to give you more tax breaks to the detriment of all of the other needs in the face of that budget deficit. What would I do in the American workplace? The issue is not incentives for you. The issue is productivity. We've got to become more productive in this country. And I think the key to doing that is to bring American workers back into a sense of sharing and participation. What do I mean by that? What's happening in a country where General Motors goes out and asks its employees for wage cuts, and then turns around and goes to its board of directors and says, give us $170 million in bonuses? Anybody want to reflect on what that means for capitalism? When managers have become so greedy in this country that they're slashing wages and giving themselves bonuses. Look what's happening on Wall Street. People are dismembering companies, dealing with the lives and jobs of Americans like so many poker chips in a casino. They tear up a company, the managers get golden parachutes, lifetime security, at the same time that they're handing out pink slips to employees saying at 5 o'clock this afternoon, you're out. And where your kids and your family are going to get their next meal is up to you. It's just tough luck. We got to move in a different direction. We've got to raise the minimum wage. We got to encourage profit sharing, employee stock ownership, a sense of participation. And I think presidential leadership can do those things. Yeah.
What do you think the future American-Israeli relationship should be?
The future American-Israeli relationship. Listen, I agonize. I'm agonizing over what's going on right now because Israel is in an impossible position. They're in an impossible position. There is a change going on in the West Bank, a stirring, giving rise to these uprisings. The Israeli government in Jerusalem has no one to negotiate with in the West Bank territories. There's nobody. I mean, Yasser Arafat, we can never ask or acquiesce in demands that the Israelis negotiate with gangsters and terrorists. We have to say that loud and clear. And then we look elsewhere and ask, where is there a negotiating partner? Sure, let's negotiate with the Jordanians, but where's King Hussein? He's hiding. He hasn't had the guts to step forward and assume his responsibility. Where is Assad? Where are the other potential leaders? Now, having described that dilemma, let me tell you what I would do as president. First of all, I would remind both Labor and, more importantly, the Likud that American policy is committed to the concept of a move toward autonomy in the West Bank, that we must dust off the Camp David agreement and understand that we are committed to changing the status quo. Maybe there'll be a ray of hope, ironically, out of all of the unrest in the West Bank. Perhaps, just perhaps, it'll give rise to a new generation of indigenous leadership which will be willing to reject Arafat and the gangsters and the terrorists. And I would encourage the Israeli leadership as a part of American policy to say, move back toward progress toward self-government in the West Bank communities. We've moved away from those concepts, and we've got to move back. And I would strongly urge the Israelis to unilaterally begin to make courageous moves to find and enhance local government in the West Bank communities. I'd start using our leverage with the Arab states. We haven't done enough of that. You know, there's an American fleet in the Persian Gulf protecting the moderate Arab states. It's our money and our blood and our boys. We're giving $3 billion a year in aid to Egypt, probably a couple $100 million a year to Jordan. We've just got to start moving. And again, ironically, out of the Persian Gulf War, the kaleidoscope may bring up some opportunities that haven't been there before, particularly in Jordan. But above all, America cannot stand by passively. Our record in the Middle East has been one of success. Not complete success, but think Sinai 1, Sinai 2, Camp David. And now more than ever, we've got to get together and build on that progress. Yeah.
That we need a progressive tax to get more revenue, and I also have heard you advocating a national sales tax. That seems like a regressive tax to me, and I was just wondering what exceptions are going to be built in to make sure it's a progressive tax, and what would make you choose that kind of tax over some other ones which would seem to hit at the lower and middle income classes a little less.
I advocate a consumption tax. It would be modeled on a European value-added tax. The poor would pay nothing. The wealthy would pay about 10 times as much as the average middle-class taxpayer. It would be a progressive tax. How do you do that? First of all, you exempt food, clothing, and shelter. Secondly, you redraw the brackets of the income tax and lower the bottom brackets to offset the increase from the value-added tax. It can be made as progressive as you want. Mine would be 0 at the bottom, 10 times as much at the top. Why have a consumption tax? I'll tell you why. The economists make the correct argument. You don't want to tax savings and investment. You want to tax consumption to give incentives to savings and investment. That's what a consumption tax is about. Secondly, you can't evade it. There are no loopholes. It'll reach the entire underground economy. Those drug dealers who don't pay any taxes today are going to pay my tax when they go out to buy the tools of their trade. That new Mercedes, the Citation jet. You can't avoid it. It is a powerful tax that reaches everybody, that has absolute equity built into it once you get the right structure.
The cost of educating a child today has really gotten almost out of proportion, especially for the middle-income family. With what President Reagan and the Congress has done as far as any kind of federal aid to students, having cut it, what do you as president recommend be done in the future?
Okay, how about student aid? Are there any students here? Okay. Paul Simon is going to come in here and tell you that all students should get grants. He's going to tell you that it's cheaper for the government to give grants than loans. And I want you to reflect on that one. Because, you see, we've got to have some reality about priorities. I don't think, given that deficit and my priorities, that I can tell you your kid is going to get a grant. Let me tell you what your kid and my kids ought to get and why I believe it. They ought to have access to as much low-interest loan money as they need. We ought to broaden that loan program. And we ought to say to the kids who apply for the loan, look, nobody ever promised you a free ride. You see, that's the old-style politics, a free ride for everybody. What we promised you was opportunity. And they'll say, well, I'll graduate with $40,000 or $50,000 in debt. And as president, I'll say, well, look, it's time to ask what it is you're going to do for your country. This is the new style politics. It's called reciprocal obligations. And I'll say to those students as president, I'll make you a deal. You want to go into teaching in a place that has teacher shortages for 5 years? I'll forgive your loan. You want to join VISTA, the Peace Corps, the military, go into a settlement house? I'll forgive your loan. And then one of them will come up and say, well, I don't want to do any of those things. And I'm never going to earn much money. And I'll say as follows. I'll say, okay, I'll limit your repayment to a modest portion of your income. And if after 20 years you haven't paid it off, we'll forgive it because that's only fair. But I'll say to those kids, if you're going to become lawyers or stockbrokers, you're going to pay it all back at prime plus 2.
Nicaragua is a symptom of the problems that are existing in Central and South America. The choices the people have there, and they are important to us, are very limited. On one hand, you have, for the most part, an oppressive or oppressive dictatorship, and the only other choice is the communist approach. What is your solution to this problem?
Well, my solution to Central America goes roughly as follows. First, we terminate Contra aid right now without any further debate, because you see, the Contras don't have support in any significant measure in Nicaragua. They're an invention of Oliver North and Reagan and this kind of soldier of fortune mentality, and they're making matters worse. I'd start in a different direction. I'd start by listening to the democracies. I mean, who is it we're trying to help in Central America? Isn't it Costa Rica, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and the democracies? The extraordinary irony of all this is that the presidents of those democracies are telling us it's time to settle up, that escalating the violence is only going to spread the conflagration across Central America. So we should listen to those presidents and get on with an agenda that has two parts to it. One is economic integration, common market, trade, all of the related issues. Those countries are too small to go it alone, and we must lead those presidents in a program of economic integration. Secondly, we must relentlessly insist upon a more equitable distribution of wealth, social justice. The social justice issues are unbelievable. I'll never forget the first time I went as a student, really as a geologist, working in Latin America. My first weeks in Bolivia, where for the first time in my life, I saw women standing barefoot in the dust in villages, holding infants in their arms which were moaning and dying of malnutrition, and they were standing there helplessly with these infants dying. And my sense of rage was such that had I been a resident of that country, I would have walked out and picked up a gun and joined anybody who was ready to drive out the incumbent government. And I got to tell you, that's the problem today in El Salvador. That's the problem. And we have to have a president who is indignant enough to say to those people, stop, stop. Because if I were a citizen of that country, I know where I'd be unless you guys change and unless we start using our leverage to change those conditions before it's too late.
I'm just wondering, what do you think is wrong with the Democratic Party in the sense of so many young people are becoming Republicans, and it just doesn't seem to be the kind of fervor that you're talking about when you were in Selma or when I was in college myself in the early 70s. Young people just aren't attracted to the Democrats as much. Why is that, and how would you change that?
I don't know. I think part of the apathy is the example that it's being set at the top. You see, the moral fiber and tone and spirit of a society is set by its leadership. And what happens in a society where Michael Deaver is on the cover of Time magazine, lounging in the back of a limousine, selling access to the president for $275,000 a minute? You know, and Ed Meese, it's a powerful message. It's a message that the real values are getting rich. It's a society in which we're celebrating Mike Milken, Boesky. Instead of sending Harvard Business School graduates out into the manufacturing and productive enterprise of this society, we've set up an incentive and leadership system which sends them to Wall Street to make a quick killing. Kids in their 30s making $1 million a year down in back alleys with suitcases, taking bribes because $1 million a year is not enough. And somehow we need to break that cycle of cynicism, the total absorption in self. The notion that we say, if I was a little sharp about the guy back there asking me about the business incentives, I didn't mean to be, but this is the kind of stuff I was thinking about, because I really think we've gone overboard on some of that. The other thing we have to do in this party, if I may, I have a feeling there are one or two Republicans here tonight. Okay, but I will talk as a Democrat. I think we've lost our grip on the imagination of the American people, because you see, we've become a party in which we promise, we take the window shopping tour. There's no question that we're the party of compassion, and that we're the ones who really do believe in those egalitarian values, and that we really do care about the homeless, about kids, about our parents. But we haven't addressed the economic piece. And that's why it is we have to challenge the American people to talk about changes in the American workplace, in dealing honestly with the deficit. Because in the absence of a rational and powerful and truthful view of our economic future, the rest of it becomes discredited. And that's why, in many respects, I'm in this race It's why I want you to keep me in this race. Because I want to be out there, not sanctimoniously, but honestly, just in the most dead honest way I can, saying, hey, there's too much at stake to continue doing business as usual. Hey, this is great fun. Somebody's got to, put the hook up when it's time, because I'm willing to stay here till sunrise, whether it comes at the usual time or whether Pat Robertson produces it a little early.
The ledge is supposed to that effect, because you can spend the next 20 minutes if you like.
Is there somebody coming after that?
Somebody's coming after that. Pete Devont is coming after that, so you're welcome to hold it as long as you want it.
Okay, he says you can stay till the next one comes. How long you folks been here today?
Seems like forever.
Okay, he says we have 20 minutes. I'll tell you what let's do. Let's take another 10 minutes, and then I will deliver you a 10-minute break as my parting shot. How's that? Yeah.
On unfair trade practices and the $48,000 Chrysler.
Well, you see, the $48,000 K car is kind of like the guys who say we're going to hire more tax collectors to balance the budget. They're wrong, but the worst thing is that they show you what's wrong with the political system. What's the answer to the trade issue? The answer to the trade issue is not retaliation. Because you see, that retaliation threatens to destroy the entire system. The problem in the system is that up at Bretton Woods 40 years ago, we wrote an agreement that was adequate for the world of those times. Europe was a pile of rubble, Japan was in ashes, and it was an agreement which kind of made America the lead engine to drive and pull a world recovery. We now have a lot of engines on the track, the OECD countries, Japan, and increasingly the other Asian countries. The way we deal with that trade agreement is to bring those countries together and say it's time to draft a new agreement requiring agreements that we balance our accounts, that impose upon all of the big players some obligations of reciprocity, not in one-to-one relationships, but in terms of balancing their accounts on the whole. Now you may say, why is that different from Dick Gephardt's proposal? It's different for one very basic reason. You don't start a shooting war that threatens to collapse the whole system. You bring people together and say, okay, we've entered into a new world and we have to have rules that reflect it. Will they go along? Sure. Why? Because there are enough people situated in the same position as the United States that we can draft an agreement with a new round of rules and liberalization and just leave out the people who don't agree. They'll agree. And that's the problem. It's the difference between a narrow, fearful, reactive, retaliatory view of the world and a world in which the President understands that the United States does have the power to lead. Yeah, way back here in the lights.
I have 3 points that you raised. One on a proposal to increase the minimum wage. I think that tends to eliminate a lot of jobs because it encourages business to automate and eliminate the low-paying jobs. Second, I was a lawyer for the Pentagon, and the idea that you can increase the warranty and thereby get a free ride on defense procurement, it doesn't work. It was thought of 30 years ago when I was down there. It's not a new idea. It's the customer who pays for warranties. The customer is the Pentagon. If you tighten the warranty, they're going to raise the price. You can't win by trying to take it out of your customer. The third point on Nicaragua, I didn't hear anything about the problem with the Soviet client state. Don't you want to think about a Soviet tank army in Managua? How far is it from the Texas border? If you won't stop them there, where are you going to stop them? Wait till they get to Houston? Thank you.
This guy doesn't sound like a Babbitt supporter. Okay, where should we start? Minimum wage, the Pentagon, the Soviets in Central America. Well, which one let me take one of them and deal with it. Which one would you like to hear? All three. I disagree on the minimum wage. The notion that you run a society by impoverishing workers is wrong. It will not make us less competitive. The minimum wage jobs are not in manufacturing. They're in the service sector. The record of automation is a mixed record, and I think there's very little evidence that the rate of job creation has been affected in any significant way by the minimum wage. Now, why is that important? Let me tell you why I feel so strongly about that. In a lot of states of this country, we're talking about moving parents off welfare. You know why they're not moving off welfare? Let me tell you why. You move off welfare into a minimum wage job, you earn $6,700 a year. That mother then turns around and has to spend $2,000 or $3,000 a year for daycare. Disposable income, $4,000, $4,500 a year. You then find, as the final indignity, that you've lost your health care coverage for your kids. Now, that's just crazy. The real value of the minimum wage has eroded in real terms by about 25 to 30% since it was last moved upward. What we've done in the last 10 years is lowered the minimum wage. And I just think that's contrary to all notions of social justice that we've all fought for. Okay. Okay, very briefly, the warranty on weapons is an old idea, I confess. It's never been implemented. Would it cost some more? Sure. We might get a little better than Northrop's MX missile guidance systems, which don't work, a Sergeant York DIVAD project, which was finally scrapped after we'd spent a couple of $1 billion, Bradley fighting vehicles, which are still not in adequate repair. The list is endless. Do you have to pay a little more? Yeah, it's worth it. Now, this business of Russian armies in Nicaragua. You know, the president keeps telling us that Managua is a 2 days drive from our border. Well, I'll tell you something. I've spent a fair amount of time in Managua, and I could never get out of town in less than 2 days. Now, how do we deal with the Russians? It's real simple. If that's your worry, you want me for president, because I'm going to deal with that. I'm going to call a guy named Gorbachev, and I'm going to say, Mike, we have national security interests in this hemisphere, and I want you to know that heavy metal is unacceptable. Now, that's the way you deal with it. Instead of arming a bunch of gangsters to murder children, okay, let's see, we've got 3 more minutes. This is getting good. Yeah.
Governor, one of the big problems all of us face is garbage removal, waste resource recovery, landfill problems. We're passing the costs along to local property tax, through the local property tax and tipping fees and things of that nature. What can the federal government do to assure us a good environment, something to do with our disposable waste, and the like?
For reasons, I want to attack the Republicans here, can I? Let me challenge you instead. I don't want to attack you. I want to challenge you over these environmental issues. The environmental issues really are not ideologically divisive. They ought to be bipartisan because Americans all across the spectrum increasingly value health and quality of life issues. And we're increasingly living in a world in which we're putting ourselves at risk. Contaminating groundwater, which causes, for example, mental retardations in kids when there's too much lead, blue babies when there's too much nitrates, carcinogens. It's happening all around us. We're dumping unbelievable amounts of toxics. We're allowing the forests and lakes of this extraordinary corner of the country to to come under the threat of destruction because we don't have the leadership to pass an acid rain bill. We're going down to buy hamburgers at McDonald's, and we get them in styrofoam trays that are made with chlorofluorocarbons, which are destroying the ozone layer. And I think, wouldn't just a little bit of leadership persuade us as Americans that we can continue our lifestyle without eating McBLTs out of styrofoam containers? The ozone layer is at risk. We're learning about the contamination of our oceans. And it's simply time for a president to pull it back together, to insist that we have a national groundwater contamination law and standards, that we clean up toxics, that we pass the acid rain bill proposed by the senator from Vermont next door, that we set standards for the emission of chlorofluorocarbons, that we clean up our country, and that we have a president who will go to the next summit meeting with the leader of the Soviet Union and say, we must deal with the twin threats to our survival. One is the sword of Damocles of nuclear weapons, and the other is the long-range degradation of tropical forests, of oceans, our marine environment, an area where we surely have a common interest, here in the United States and all over this world, and it can be done with American leadership. Okay, let me take one more. Right there.
Yes, sir. I'm from Memphis, Tennessee, and we don't really have the opportunity, like y'all do up here, to get to hear all the presidential candidates.
Well, you see, when you're from Memphis, Tennessee, you know, I was thinking about entering that primary down there, Senator Gore's home state, and I thought, yeah, sure, I'll come there, even if I only get 2% of the vote.
Okay. My question is, there's been much criticism about the way we elect our presidents today, and I was wondering what your feelings would be of how you would like to change this process in order that it be something to be more fair to all the candidates to have the opportunity to be a president.
Did you all hear the question? How would I change is the current process unfair, and how would I change it? Now, what state are we in tonight? I don't know. Let me just say this seriously. There are a lot of proposals on the table, and the trade-offs are very simple. If you get a larger front-end sample, have more primaries right up front, you lose the retail store. The chance for people like Bruce Babbitt, who frankly didn't start off as a household name, and some would say do not finish as a household name, candidates who don't have a lot of money, but who care deeply about the process and who are burning with a rather different sense of America's future. You see, this system allows me to be here tonight. So, I guess kind of like what Winston Churchill once wrote about democracy. He said it is an incomprehensible, crazy, unworkable system. It's just that all the other alternatives are even worse. So I guess that's the best I can do for you. Let me close, if I may, by asking myself one question, which I'd like to wrap on, and then I'll read the last question. I'd like to say just a word about all of the foreign policy issues. We've touched tonight just on Israel and Central America. You see, there's a broader set of foreign policy issues because this administration has for 7 years told the American people that the world is a conspiracy closing in on us, that we're losing. And it has conducted a foreign policy based on confrontation, on soldiers of fortune, on violations of the Constitution and the law, drug their feet on arms control, because they see a conspiracy and they lack courage. They're afraid. They're sitting in a bunker telling us that it's still 1950 or maybe 1850. They're still asking who lost China. They're still living at the height of the Cold War. This led us to one mistake after another. And the tragedy is that it's not an accurate description of the world, because you see, right now we're in the midst of a world revolution, and we're winning. Our values, market economics, are taking root all over Asia, even China beginning to break open and outward. And correspondingly, Marxism is dying. It's a dead economic theory. Gorbachev understands this and is now turning inward to try to rescue a fading empire, which is still dangerous militarily, but which has lost its economic rationale all over this world. It's a world in motion, a revolution of American values. And you see, the problem is that the protectionists, the people who want to scale back our presence in the world, the people who want to fight a Cold War, don't understand that we must be out there leading with values, leading with these economic issues, not retreating, but leading, because we really are on the threshold of an incredible world revolution. And we've got to go out and meet it like the confident winners that we are. Now, lastly, best question of the night. Is it fun to be a candidate? I don't know. It depends on what day of the week you ask me, which poll I've read, which newspaper reporter is either praising you or beating you up.